Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. On today's episode, we'll cover the recent headlines and introduce another new segment, Industry Perspectives, where we'll have short-form conversations with key voices in the life science ecosystem about topics of the day. With that, let's get into this week's episode. I'm excited to get into our Industry Perspectives conversation, but first, here are a few things we're thinking about this week. Up top is the news that Dr. Vinay Prasad will return to the FDA and run CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Dr. Prasad started that job in May and then resigned only a couple weeks ago, following a dramatic turn with the Duchenne's muscular disorder, DMD community, after pausing the use of Sarepta's gene therapy following the death of two patients. Intense backlash led to the FDA reversing course and allowing the use of that gene therapy. But it was certainly a scar on Dr. Prasad's beginning tenure. Probably more notable and maybe more consequential, however, was growing concern among conservatives that he simply wasn't Trump enough due to some old social media posts that didn't show support for the president. Dr. Prasad nominally said he wanted to return to California to spend time with his family, and yet here we are only 10 days later, and he is coming back to the FDA. Shakespearean antics aside, the bigger question is, how is our industry supposed to move forward with certainty when there are so many tumultuous changes at the agency responsible for giving certainty to the American public that the medicines we're investing in and growing actually work? Also in the news this week is HHS's cancellation of $500 million of BARDA contracts that was ostensibly for more research into mRNA. mRNA stands for messenger RNA. It's a type of genetic material that carries instructions from DNA to the cell's protein-making machinery. In short, it tells your cells what proteins to make. And proteins being essential for cell function, it's like mRNA is a recipe, telling the cells which one to build. In the news ever since COVID are mRNA vaccines, which use this process. Instead of a traditional vaccine injecting a piece of a virus, mRNA vaccines give your cells instructions to make a piece of the virus, like the spike protein in COVID-19, which then trains your immune system to fight against it. So mRNA has certainly come into vogue over the last 5 years, but it's not without controversy. It's actually at the center of so much of the vaccine debate that RFK Jr. has participated in. And so it's both with no surprise, but a decent amount of concern that the HHS took the next step at the leadership level to move away from mRNA research. We've gotten competing explanations out of HHS for the cancellation of these contracts and concern about mRNA more broadly. HHS Secretary RFK Jr., he cited concerns about the mRNA vaccine's effectiveness against respiratory infections, framing the decision as a shift towards what he described as safer, broader vaccine platforms. So from the secretary's perspective, it's just simply that mRNA vaccines aren't as effective. But NIH Director Jay Bhattacharya, speaking on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast earlier this week, offered a different perspective. He commented that there just isn't willingness among the American population to take mRNA vaccines. And there is some truth to that. mRNA vaccines have had higher skepticism rates than traditional vaccines, and we've seen that in some of the uptick. But it's divergent opinions and explanations that give industry pause. Why are we canceling vaccine research? And response from the broader scientific community was swift and loud. Michael Osterholm, who runs the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, said, quote, "This may be the most dangerous public health judgment that I've seen in my 50 years in this business. It is baseless, and we will pay a tremendous price in terms of illnesses and deaths. I'm extremely worried about it." As one of several folks who responded publicly saying, this is the wrong direction and a growing concern, and there is a lot of promise around the mRNA platform. And finally, we continue to wait on President Trump's announcement of possible tariffs related to pharmaceuticals. That'll follow closely the end of the Section 232 investigation. If that term's new for you, check out our in-depth tariffs episode, where we talked about the Department of Commerce's investigation into national security concerns around the development of drugs abroad. Either way, industry does seem to be waiting for the shoe to drop. President Trump has teased a possible 250% tariff, maybe phased in over time, maybe not. The implications of which we get into in our tariffs episode. But you should follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and all the other places we provide updates, because news is coming. Next up, we have our first industry perspective segment. And who better than to bring back one of our most popular guests, Patrick Jordan of NovaQuest Capital. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
John, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see you.
Well, we're here to take an industry perspective at some of the things going on. We've talked a little bit about earlier today on the show, the Dr. Vinay Prasad saga, soap opera, whatever you want to call it. Not speaking necessarily to the specifics of that, but how critical from an investor perspective is certainty out of the FDA, review times, things like what does that mean to you to have a predictable FDA?
It's key. I mean, look, the whole enterprise of drug development is ridden with uncertainty from the start. You think about just scientific discovery at its basis. That is an uncertain endeavor and an uncertain outcome. And so when you have around that uncertainty around regulatory positions, pricing, that makes not only the efforts of trying to get a drug approved, but to finance a drug becomes even challenging too, because the market pays close attention to that uncertainty and wants to avoid the market risk.
Zooming out, NovaQuest, big fund, key player, both not just in the great North Carolina ecosystem, but nationally, even globally. How's the environment? It has been a painful 3 years, 5 years. I mean, it depends on how long you want to say, but what trends are you seeing big picture over at NovaQuest? How are you thinking about this current moment?
I think you're right to call it a challenging market. I've always been someone who looks towards the bright side of things. Time period, it's been really about 4 years of difficulty for biopharma. You think about the indices being at their high in February of 2021, but since then there was just a lot of compression on values of companies, and a lot of companies went through a period of trading at points that were less than their cash value, and then many of them disappeared. The optimism that I got is that nonetheless you have some very attractive industry with outstanding innovation that needs to find a path forward. The industry as a whole, and I've been a part of this for 30 plus years, I think has a lot of enthusiasm for finding treatments that make a difference in patients' lives, whether that's in the US or globally.
And I think it's paradoxical that we're in this moment of compression, and yet rising populism across the board. And that's not just limited to the Trump administration. I mean, we are in a populist moment where historic policy beliefs aren't really in vogue. And so one of the common ones is people are frustrated about the cost of healthcare. Drugs are out front as being a part of healthcare. And just this relentless pressure of people being upset about drug prices. And yet, biotech, pharma more broadly, are living through this very painful capital markets moment. How do you think that populism is playing a role? And you're someone who I know, whether it's through your leadership in your state association, I know you get to Washington. Do you see a through line between that populism and that frustration with some of the policies I've heard you kind of speak out against in Washington?
John, it's one thing that I very much understand just as a consumer, as a patient, as someone who has a family that are patients. When you think about pricing of pharmaceutical products, I get it. And I know I can speak for myself, but I think for a lot in our industry, we're really moved to make medicines more affordable, more effective, to bend down the cost of care overall. When you think about it, it's useful to put things in perspective. The pharmaceutical industry actually makes a very small percentage on a relative basis to the overall cost of spending for staying healthy. So it has become a bit of a lightning rod for the industry because it becomes so front and center when you're talking about comparing prices in the US to other markets, which behave very differently.
On a previous episode, you've talked about the small molecule penalty, the passage of the EPIC Act. And, since that conversation, another issue, of course, has arisen. And that's this concept of tying prices for drugs in the US to what we pay or to what foreigners pay, foreign reference pricing, what President Trump calls most favored nation. I mean, the ultimate populist idea. Hey, they've got it cheaper over there. That's the price we should pay. As someone so ensconced in this, can that work? What's flawed with the idea of let's all just pay lowest possible prices?
I think the intention is good, that we want to make medicines the most affordable for as many people in the US as possible. The intention for most favored nation pricing, making our drugs the same price or less than anybody else's, I think that intention is a reasonable one. But the practicality of it is where I think it's gone wrong. The healthcare delivery systems in the US is fundamentally different from, say, in Europe, where you have much broader access. In the US, you have middlemen, PBMs that are involved in the distribution between pharmaceutical company and the eventual patient. And so, in a lot of ways, trying to implement most favored nation pricing without recognizing the differences in the US to, say, Europe is like trying to do an organ transplant that's not matching the donor to the recipient. You might be able to get it done, but long term, eventually the patient doesn't do well.
God, that's the best analogy. We are absolutely going to steal that. We'll attribute it here to Patrick Jordan, but it is like an organ transplant where the donor doesn't match up with the patient. And it may work for a minute, but it's not going to work long term. We are absolutely stealing that, Patrick. One of those basket countries that you get referred to, and it's a place I think you and I share a fondness for, and that's Japan. And Japan has publicly said they are very concerned about their drug lag and drug loss because of their pricing policies. 70% of medicines available in the US that are innovative over the last couple of years, not available in Japan. And if I remember correctly, for our listeners, I've had the opportunity of going around Washington with Patrick. And one of the stories you shared really stuck out because in this MFN debate, we haven't talked about the pricing in foreign countries. And when I talk to people and we say, oh, a drug costs twice as much here than it does in Europe or Japan, they still assume, well, you're a for-profit company. You must be selling in Europe and still making profit. So you'd still make that profit over here. That's a misconception. And you opened my eyes to a unique experience you've had. You dealt with potentially selling a product in Japan, and I don't think they wanted to be too fair on pricing. Can you share a little bit of the specifics of that and what's your takeaway of it wasn't just unreasonable, it was unprofitable?
Yeah, and you're right. You and I share that strong affinity for Japan. In fact, I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and historically, the Japanese market's been an extraordinary pharmaceutical marketplace. A lot of great innovation, but as you're describing, over recent years, the pharmaceutical industry has really slowed, and so there is a need for rekindling that innovation. Unfortunately, there are some cross currents that need to be overcome, and it does come to pricing. We've seen in pharmaceutical products, particularly with smaller companies that are looking to enter, say, the Japanese market, there's a pricing system that will evaluate the drug and find the closest comparator product, and sometimes that comparator product could be a generic. Just because it's a comparator doesn't mean that it is equivalent. In fact, it may well be inferior, but nonetheless, you have a comparator drug that has an inferior profile and a lower cost that goes against a better drug that has better results for the patient. And if you're trying to peg that to low-cost drugs that haven't been innovated in 20, 30 years, pharmaceutical companies rightly would reach the decision, we can't deploy this drug and make it available to the thousands, if not millions of patients in a market because pricing just simply doesn't allow it. It becomes infeasible for a company to present it to patients as an option.
Oh, it's such, I want to stay with that and almost say it back to you because I think this actually will be eye-opening for some people because we don't really think about comparators in the US. Yes, when you get into the weeds of approaching a payer, they're going to look at what else is in that class. So it's not like this is totally foreign, but to the American patient, it is foreign. It's no pun intended. Your doctor writes you a script and you go fill it at Walgreens or CVS. We are agnostic on the Making Medicine podcast and independent pharmacies. So this idea that you're going to a country saying, hey, we've got this great new drug. It's going to be meaningful for a patient population. And they're almost pulling up, okay, well, it's similar to this drug. It's in the same ballpark treating this disease. We want you to price it similar to that. And, I'm thinking of TVs only because I'm in the market for TVs. And it's like saying, hey, you need to price your product the same as an RCA set out of the 90s, even though your new TV is capable of doing infinitely more, being more helpful. It's brighter. You can see dark parts of the screen, all the good things the innovation valued. Hey, Patrick, you got to price it like an RCA set, which might be 35 cents, even possibly lower than the cost of production. Am I hearing that right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you absolutely are. And I think the analogy to the TV is a good one. That unfortunately you have over the course of the last decades, advancements in televisions, just like you do advancements in pharmaceutical products. And in order to finance and fund those advancements, you need to have an attractive price point for the end product. And that end product may have a lot better attributes, just like you're describing on the TV. The pharmaceutical product would have the same thing: better utility, better tolerability, better outcomes to the patient. And that does require investment. Oftentimes that investment goes over many years, even decades. And so pharmaceutical companies do need to have a mechanism to recover and to make profits from such investment and that risk that they've undertaken.
Yeah, one of your fellow investors was nudging me recently with a war on the word recoup. And not using, because the point isn't recouping. I think your LPs at NovaQuest would not be very amused if you only recouped the investments, but there has to be a return on that investment. And I just think it was so stark in the meetings that we shared together where you shared this anecdote of a country was asking you to sell your product at possibly lower than the cost of goods produced. I mean, that is the system. It's not, hey, we can make a little less profit. It is, in one of these systems, you might make no profit. And yes, the rest of the world is free riding on the US. But I'll put this to you, I won't lead the witness here. If the US priced medicines the way some European countries or Japan does, would you be able to raise money to invest in new medicines? Or
it would definitely stifle innovation and the access to capital. Think about it this way. Large companies may be able to make a business decision to enter in a market and have a loss leader on a product. They've got a bigger portfolio that would be able to balance out on pricing. Small companies, they simply don't. That drug that they're trying to get into a new country may be the only drug they have. And so you're not able to share the load, balance the load across your portfolio. And that matters in innovation. When you think about FDA approvals over the last several years, 2/3 of FDA drugs that are approved by the FDA are from small companies outside of the top 20 biopharma who simply don't have a big portfolio to balance the load on.
So your point, I think maybe we haven't heard enough of, is something like MFN or some of these ideas disproportionately harm a small biotech who just can't spread the impact across an entire company.
That's a fair way to describe it.
Well, You've been very generous with your time. I can't think of anyone better to have on our first segment of Industry Perspectives. I hope it won't be the last, but any closing thoughts that, and maybe it's always good to end on a positive note. What's got you energized this year?
As I'd said at the outset, John, I'm a market optimist in terms of the pharmaceutical industry. The pace of innovation, I think, can go without bound. The ways that we can streamline drug development, improve predictability of outcomes, increase the value that we have for pharmaceutical products to bend the cost of care. I'm a believer that the industry has a great opportunity to do it. And I think we can do it with the right mindset of approaching pharmaceutical products with a way to make them affordable, make them accessible to patients. And that's the real result that I think the industry is trying to get to make these drugs that are at a price point that is reasonable for patients, that ultimately reduces the cost of care and improves lives.
He is Patrick Jordan of NovaQuest Capital. Thank you, Patrick, for your time today and joining our first Industry Perspectives segment.
John, thanks for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on the world of policy and innovation. Follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description of this video. And as always, keep innovating.